Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. Mia's eyes were glued to the cash register screen as she scanned the last item of Mrs. Jenkins's grocery haul. The digital clock in the corner read 9:57 p.m., a mere 3 minutes away from sweet freedom. The fluorescent lights of the Walmart buzzed above, casting a harsh glow on the tired faces of the few remaining shoppers. The hum of the air conditioning was the only constant in the otherwise quiet store. Mrs. Jenkins chuckled as she swiped her credit card, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. You know, I used to work night shifts too, back when I was your age. You get used to the quiet eventually. Mia forced a smile. Yeah, I'm sure it'll grow on me. She didn't believe it, though. The stillness of the night always made her feel like something was waiting just outside the bright, safe bubble of the store, ready to pounce as soon as she stepped into the darkness. The beep of the card machine was drowned out by a sudden, ear-piercing siren that blared through the PA system, sending a shockwave of panic through the aisles. The lights flickered before switching to red emergency mode. The screens around the store flickered to life, displaying an eerie message. Emergency broadcast system. This is not a test. Infection outbreak reported in the Detroit area. Stay indoors. Avoid contact with others. Further instructions will follow. The chatter of the shoppers grew frantic. Phones buzzed and beeped in unison as they all received the same message. The sliding doors parted with a hiss, and a wave of warm, sticky summer air rolled in. The customers' faces grew paler than the bleached white tiles as they read the text on their screens, confirming the horror playing out before their eyes. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the chaos unfold. People shoved carts aside, knocking over displays as they rushed for the exits. The siren outside grew louder, melding with the distant screams and honks of car horns. Mrs. Jenkins's hand trembled as she took her receipt. What on earth is happening? Mia had no answer. The only thing she knew for sure was that the quiet she'd dreaded had just become a whole lot more terrifying. A sudden crash echoed through the store, the sound of shattering glass cutting through the panic like a knife. The doors to the gardening section slammed open, and a group of people stumbled through, their faces contorted in rage. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, eyes glazed over with a madness that seemed to have swallowed any trace of humanity. One of them, a young man with a torn Walmart vest, lunged at a mother and her child. The woman's scream was abruptly silenced as the man's teeth sank into her neck. The little boy's eyes went wide with horror, and he took off running. The store descended into pandemonium as the infected swarmed in from the parking lot, attacking anyone they could grab hold of. Shrieks of terror filled the air, punctuated by the sickening sound of flesh tearing and bones snapping. Mia and Mrs. Jenkins stumbled back, knocking over a display of chips in their haste to get away from the bloodthirsty mob. They retreated towards the back of the store, trying to find a place to hide. The stockroom door slammed shut behind them, leaving them in a stark, cold silence. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the distant cries of the doomed. Mrs. Jenkins leaned against the metal shelves, her knees threatening to buckle. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mia took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for Mrs. Jenkins too. "We need to find the others," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "There must be a safe place in the store we can all go. Maybe the office." They tiptoed through the dimly lit aisles, the glow from the emergency lights casting long shadows. The smell of fresh soil and fertilizer mingled with the metallic scent of fear. They passed by rows of neatly stacked boxes, the quiet a stark contrast to the chaos just beyond the stockroom walls. Mia's hand tightened around the heavy flashlight she'd grabbed from the shelf, the plastic cool against her sweaty palm. Every creak and groan of the ancient supermarket sent her heart racing, her imagination conjuring up monsters lurking in the darkened corners. But the real monsters were outside, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they found their way in. Their steps grew heavier as they approached the office, the door hanging open like a gaping mouth. The sight that greeted them was grisly, the floor slick with blood, the walls spattered with it. The store manager lay sprawled across the floor, his eyes glassy and lifeless, the side of his head caved in. The infected had already been here. Mrs. Jenkins gagged, her hand flying to her mouth. Mia's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of the employees who had taken shelter here. Her gaze fell upon a small, trembling figure huddled beneath the manager's desk. It was Steve, the night janitor. His eyes were wide with terror, but he was uninjured. They crouched beside him, whispering reassurances. "What happened?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Steve's eyes darted to the door before he spoke. "They got in. We tried to hold them off, but..." He swallowed hard. "They're everywhere." The sirens outside grew louder, and with them the moans of the infected grew closer. They had to move, find another place to hide. But where could they go now? The store had become a maze of danger, every aisle a potential death trap. And the infection, it spread with every bite. If they weren't careful, they could be the next to fall. Mia's mind raced as she peered into the darkness beyond the office. They had to find a way to survive this nightmare. And fast. "We need weapons," she murmured, her voice shaking slightly. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her eyes darting around the room. "The sporting goods section," she suggested, her voice strained. "They have bats, maybe something sharper too." They helped Steve to his feet and moved with urgency towards the aisles, their flashlights cutting through the shadows like tiny beams of hope. The store's layout was a blur in Mia's mind as adrenaline surged through her veins. The world outside the cocoon of the stockroom had turned into a living hell, and she could feel the weight of every second that ticked by. As they reached the sporting goods, the sound of shuffling feet grew louder. They had to act quickly. Mia's hands trembled as she grabbed a baseball bat, feeling the solid weight of it in her grip. Mrs. Jenkins found a small knife in a camping display, while Steve took a crowbar that had been left behind by a fleeing customer. They armed themselves, ready to face the horrors that awaited them. They moved deeper into the store, passing the frozen foods section. The cold air that usually brought relief on a hot summer night now only served to remind Mia of the chill that had settled in her bones. The freezers hummed a mournful tune, the only sound in the eerie quiet, save for their footsteps echoing down the aisles. As they approached the electronics section, a figure stumbled into view. It was Karen, a cashier from Mia's shift, her eyes wild with fear. "They're coming," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "They're everywhere." Mia's heart skipped a beat. The infected had found their way in. They had to move now. The group huddled together, their makeshift weapons at the ready, and continued their desperate search for a safe haven. The tension grew thicker with each step, the air pregnant with the promise of a brutal encounter. A shiver ran down Mia's spine as she thought of the people she knew, her friends and colleagues, now possibly turned into the monsters that stalked the aisles. She clenched the bat tighter, her knuckles white. She was almost hysterical. the reality of the situation crashing down on her like a heavy fog. They had to find a place to hide, to regroup, and to figure out what the hell was happening outside. The trio pushed through the swinging doors that led to the employee break room, the faint scent of stale coffee and burnt microwave dinners now overpowered by the coppery tang of blood. The room was empty, thankfully, but the sight of an overturned chair and a smashed vending machine told a grisly story of a struggle. They locked the door behind them, their chests heaving with exertion and fear. For now, they were safe. But the horror was out there, and it was getting closer with every passing moment. They had to hold out, had to find a way to survive the night, and as they sat in the flickering light of the emergency lamp, Mia couldn't help but wonder if dawn would ever come. Steve spoke up, his voice strained. "We should try to get to the manager's office. There's a radio, a phone, a TV. Maybe we can find out what's happening, call for help." Mrs. Jenkins nodded in agreement, her eyes never leaving the crack under the door, watching for any sign of movement. "Good idea," she said, her voice shaky. "We might find something to protect ourselves better, too." They took a deep breath and stood up, their makeshift weapons in hand. The quiet was suffocating, the only sound the distant howling of the infected, growing closer. They approached the door with caution, listening for any sign of danger. Mia put her ear to the cold metal, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't hear anything," she whispered. They stepped out into the hallway, the lights above flickering in time with the sirens outside. The floor was sticky with something wet, and Mia tried not to think about what it might be. They moved swiftly but silently, their eyes peeled for any movement. The corridor was lined with photos of smiling employees, the sight of their carefree expressions a stark contrast to the nightmare unfolding before them. The office was just around the corner, but it might as well have been miles away. They turned the corner, and there it was, the manager's office, a beacon of hope in the sea of chaos. The door was closed, the wood marred with deep gouges as if something had been trying to get in, or out. Mrs. Jenkins tried the handle, her hand shaking. It was locked. "We need to find the key," she murmured. Mia scanned the area, her eyes falling on a set of keys hanging from a hook on the wall. She moved towards it, her heart racing. If they could get into the office, they could radio for help, call the police, do something, anything. Her hand reached out and plucked the keys from the hook, the metal cold and comforting in her palm. She held her breath as she inserted the largest one into the lock, twisted it, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was a mess of overturned furniture and scattered papers, but the radio, phone, and TV were all intact. They rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The sound of the lock clicking into place was music to their ears. For a brief moment, they allowed themselves to believe that they might just make it through this hellish night. But outside, the screams grew louder, a grim reminder that their battle for survival had only just begun. Mia's eyes immediately darted to the security monitors on the wall, displaying a series of grainy, black and white images of the store's interior. The screens flickered with the movements of the infected as they prowled the aisles, seeking out the last vestiges of human life. The sight of their former colleagues and customers being overwhelmed by the crazed mob was almost too much to bear. Steve moved closer to the monitors, his eyes scanning the screens with a newfound sense of urgency. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the feed from the parking lot. "Some of the cars are still running." Mrs. Jenkins gasped. Could we get out that way?" Mia felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. "If we can sneak outside without them seeing us, maybe we can get to one of those cars and get out of here." They studied the monitors intently, plotting a path through the carnage to the exit doors. The infected moved in erratic patterns, driven by a primal hunger that seemed to override any semblance of strategy. But as they watched, the group saw that some of the survivors had banded together, fighting back with whatever they could grab. The scene was grim, but it wasn't entirely hopeless. Karen joined them, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice calm. "We're going to get to those cars. We have to stick together and stay quiet. Can you do that?" Karen nodded, gripping the bat that Mia had handed her tightly. They had formed a makeshift family of survivors, bound by fear and the desperate need to live. They moved quickly, staying low and close to the walls, using the shelves for cover. The floor was slick with a mix of sweat and blood, making every step treacherous. They could hear the snarls and growls of the infected growing closer, feel the heat of their breath as they passed the end of each aisle. The exit doors loomed ahead, a beacon of salvation in the sea of horror. They had made it to the front of the store without encountering the infected, but as they approached the doors, they heard a commotion from the parking lot. More of the creatures had arrived, drawn by the noise and the smell of fear. Mia's heart hammered in her chest as she peered through the glass. The cars they'd seen were surrounded, their engines purring tantalizingly. The keys to the office had unlocked the door to the outside world, but it was clear that the escape route wasn't going to be as simple as they'd hoped. They were outnumbered and outmatched, but the alternative was to wait here and become the hunted. They exchanged a silent look of understanding. There was no turning back now. They had to fight their way through this horde, or die trying. Gripping their weapons, they took a moment to collect themselves, bracing for the battle ahead. The door creaked open, and the night air rushed in, thick with the stench of decay. The infected turned as one, their eyes locking onto the fresh meat that had just presented itself. Mia took the lead, swinging her bat with a ferocity born of desperation. The first few swings connected, knocking back the nearest attackers. But for every one they took down, more took their place. The parking lot was a maelstrom of flailing limbs and snapping teeth. They had to keep moving, had to get to the cars. The headlights pierced the gloom, offering a path through the chaos. Mrs. Jenkins stumbled, a hand reaching out to grab Mia's arm. "I can't," she gasped. "I'm too old for this." Mia's eyes never left the horde. "You can," she said fiercely. "You have to." With renewed determination, the trio pushed forward, dodging and weaving through the mass of infected. The sound of breaking glass and distant wails grew closer, hinting at the chaos that had overtaken the city beyond the confines of the store. They had almost reached the cars when Mia saw it, a flash of blue and red lights cutting through the darkness. Her heart leaped with hope. The wail of sirens grew louder, and she squinted to make out the shapes of 4 police officers, guns drawn, fighting off the infected with a precision that spoke of grim experience. "Police!" one of them shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony of the night. "This way!" They sprinted towards the officers, the promise of rescue a tantalizing mirage. The officers formed a protective barricade around them, firing shots that rang out like a war zone. The infected fell back, but not without taking a few bullets. The officers herded them into a waiting SUV, the engine purring with the promise of escape. But as they neared the vehicle, Mrs. Jenkins' legs gave out beneath her. She fell with a cry, her frail body no match for the adrenaline that had fueled their desperate flight. Before Mia could react, 2 of the infected broke through the officers' defenses and descended upon her. Mia's scream was lost in the roar of gunfire as the officers tried to fend off the attackers. Steve dove forward using his crowbar to beat back the creatures, but it was too late. The infected had latched onto Mrs. Jenkins' arm, tearing through the thin fabric of her sleeve, revealing the delicate, vulnerable flesh beneath. With a snarl, one of the officers stepped forward, aiming his gun at the monsters feasting on their new prey. The shots rang out, and the infected stumbled, releasing their grip. But the damage was done. Mrs. Jenkins' eyes rolled back in her head, and a trickle of blood spilled from her mouth. The horror was too much for Mia to process. The remaining officers ushered them into the SUV, their expressions grim. "We have to go," the one in the driver's seat said, his voice tight with urgency. "There are more of them coming." The doors slammed shut, and the vehicle lurched forward, tires screeching on the asphalt. Mia stared out the window, watching the Walmart shrink into the distance. She felt a hand on her shoulder, and she looked over to see Steve, his face etched with pain and determination. They had lost Mrs. Jenkins, but they were still alive. But then, a twisted shadow emerged from the store's entrance, moving with a jerky, inhuman gait. Mia's heart stopped as she recognized the blue cardigan and gray hair of the woman who had been so kind to her. Mrs. Jenkins was on her feet, her eyes now glazed and hungry. The infection had claimed her. Mia's scream pierced the air, her body convulsing with sobs. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The woman who had offered her comfort, who had become a beacon of hope in this nightmare, was now one of them. She pounded the window, the glass cold and unyielding under her fists. "No, no, no!" she shrieked, her voice hoarse with grief. The officers exchanged a worried glance, their own fears mirrored in their eyes. They knew they had to keep moving, but the sight of Mrs. Jenkins was too much for Mia to handle. She collapsed into a heap on the floor of the car, her cries echoing through the cabin as they sped away from the scene of carnage. The SUV jolted and swerved around abandoned cars, the world outside a blur of shadow and light. The radio crackled with static, the occasional voice cutting through the noise, but the messages were garbled, filled with panic and despair. The city of Detroit had become a battleground for the survival of the fittest, and it was clear that the infected had the upper hand.